They say a wolf without a pack is already dead. But what they never tell you, what no elder, no alpha, no bloodline scroll ever warns you about, is that the cruelest death isn't the one that tears out your throat. It's the one that happens in front of everyone you ever called family, while the man you loved watches with cold eyes and says nothing. Selene Vera was born to lead nations. Tonight, she's being erased. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments, because what happens next, nobody sees coming, not even her. Asam Bokuwan. The torches had been burning for 3 hours before Selene understood what kind of night it was going to be. She'd felt it in the way the pack moved around her, not with the usual current of warmth that ran through Iron Moon's great hall during a formal gathering, but with something stilted and careful, like water finding a way around a stone it doesn't want to disturb. Warriors who had nodded at her in the corridors that morning now studied the stone floor when she passed. Elder wives who had pressed her hands and called her daughter at the last moon ceremony kept their backs turned, their shoulders drawn tight as bowstrings. No one met her eyes. Not one soul in a hall packed with 300 wolves. Selene had learned early that silence in a pack was never empty. It always carried weight. Tonight, it was crushing. She stood near the eastern pillar, her pillar, the one she'd claimed as a girl of 16 when Kael first brought her to the capital and said, "Stand here. This is where the Luna stands during formal proceedings. Stand here and look like you belong." She had practiced belonging for 6 years. She had worn the silver circlet and spoken in measured tones and swallowed every wound that came with being the last of a dead bloodline grafted onto a living throne. She had been so careful, so relentlessly, exhaustingly careful. Her dress was the color of deep wine, fitted at the shoulders, simple in the way Kael preferred, nothing that drew more attention than necessary, nothing that reminded the court she carried blood older than the Iron Moon pack itself. Her dark hair was pinned back, her spine was straight. She looked, she knew, exactly like what she'd been trained to look like, composed, appropriate, almost invisible. The great doors at the far end of the hall swung open. The sound that came in before the figure did was the sound of the court, forgetting to pretend. A collective inhale that moved through the room like a wind. Even the torch flames seemed to lean. Lyra Vale walked through the door like she was walking back into something she had never genuinely left. Selene had heard the name, of course. You could not spend 6 years in Kael Thornheart's orbit and not learn the architecture of his history. Lyra Vale, former consort, former favorite, the woman who had vanished 3 years before Selene arrived when Kael took her as his promised Luna. The court spoke of Lyra the way people spoke of a fire that had finally gone out, with relief and with a trace of mourning for the warmth. But fires, Selene thought now, watching the woman cross the polished stone floor with that particular kind of ease that only came from absolute certainty, fires that looked like they'd gone out were sometimes just waiting for new air. Lyra was everything the court whispered, and then some. Tall, copper-skinned, with black hair loose around her shoulders, and a gown that moved like liquid shadow. She wore no circlet, no formal insignia, and that absence, that deliberate nakedness of rank, was somehow louder than any crown. She didn't need rank. She walked in a way that made rank irrelevant, and she was looking directly at Kael. Selene turned. Kael Thornheart stood at the head of the hall on the raised dais, where he always stood for formal gatherings. He was 32 years old and built like the territory he ruled, broad and severe, with a jaw that could have been cut from the same granite as the Iron Moon's walls. His dark hair was close-cropped, his coat unadorned black, and the Alpha's seal burned silver at his collar. He had the kind of face that never gave much away in public, and Selene had spent years learning to read the small things, the angle of his shoulders, the set of his mouth, the particular stillness that meant he was feeling something he had chosen not to name. He was very still right now. But the stillness was wrong. It wasn't the stillness of control. It was the stillness of a man standing in the exact center of what he wanted. Something cold moved through Selene's chest. Not fear. Not quite. The thing underneath fear. The thing that lived in the place where you kept your certainties and arrived to tell you, quietly and without cruelty, that something you believed was no longer true. She made herself breathe, made herself stand the way she'd been trained to stand. Lyra reached the dais and stopped 3 steps below it. Close enough. The hall was so quiet Celine could hear the torch oil hissing in its iron cups. Alpha Thornheart, Lyra's voice was low and unhurried. I heard you were running this place into the ground without me. There was a beat, one horrible, tectonic beat, and then Kael smiled. It wasn't the diplomatic curve he showed the elders or the tight satisfaction he allowed himself after winning a border dispute. It was a real smile. Celine had seen it maybe a handful of times in 6 years, and it had always been directed at her. Had been. Past tense. The grammar of loss moved through her like something physical. You heard right, Kael said. That was the moment Celine understood the shape of the night. She spent the next hour watching the hall rearrange itself around Lyra Vale, the way a river rearranged itself around a new rock. Not fighting, not resisting, simply finding the natural course of things. Warriors laughed too loudly at Lyra's remarks. Elder Harrow, who had presided over Celine's own binding ceremony with careful dignity, leaned in close to Lyra and spoke in low, intimate tones. Even Breck, Kael's second-in-command and the closest thing Celine had to an ally in the inner circle, stood at the edge of the dais watching Lyra with an expression Celine couldn't fully parse. Not hostility, not welcome. Something like resignation, which was in some ways worse than either. No one came to stand beside Celine. She stood at her pillar, and she did not move. This was also something she'd learned. When everything was uncertain, when the ground was shifting under you and you couldn't yet see the shape of what was coming, you held your ground. You gave them nothing to point to. You waited. She didn't have to wait long. At the second hour of the gathering, Kael raised his hand and the hall settled into formal silence. His eyes swept the room in that slow, comprehensive way he had, cataloging, assessing, measuring. And then they found Celine's and held. She met his gaze. 6 years had taught her to do that, at least. Whatever was inside her in this moment, the cold thing, the hollow thing, she kept it out of her face. She gave him eyes like flat water. Something shifted in his expression. Not regret, not quite guilt. She would have known those. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was moving through the formality of executing it. People of the Iron Moon Pack, Kael said. His voice was the kind that carried without effort, that settled into rooms and stayed. I've called this gathering to announce a change in the succession structure of this pack's leadership. Celine's hands, hidden in the folds of her wine-dark dress, curled into fists. The position of Luna, the primary consort of the Alpha Bloodline and co-ruler of Iron Moon territory, has been held provisionally for the past 6 years by Celine Vera of the Crimson Fang line. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which no one breathed. Effective tonight, that position is dissolved. Celine Vera is relieved of all titles, privileges, and designations associated with Iron Moon leadership. The hall didn't gasp. That was the worst part. The hall had already known. Every person in this room had known before she walked through the door, and no one, not one among 300 wolves who had shared her meals and called her by name, had thought to warn her. The title of Luna, Kael continued, and his voice did not change at all, did not soften, did not roughen, did not carry any texture of apology or discomfort, is hereby granted to Lyra Vale, of the Vale bloodline, to be formally bound at the next full moon. Lyra, standing 3 steps below the dais, inclined her head with the grace of someone accepting something that had always belonged to her. Celine stood at her pillar and did not move. She became aware of people turning to look at her. Not the quick, furtive glances of an hour ago, but open looks. The kind that crowds gave to public spectacles. Checking for a reaction, hunting for the crack. She gave them nothing. She stood the way stone stood, but her hands, hidden in the dark folds of her dress, were bleeding where her nails had cut her palms. Kyle stepped down from the dais. He crossed the hall toward her, and the crowd parted in silence, and for one uncontrolled second Celine thought, she actually thought, because she was still human enough to hope against the evidence, that he was coming to explain. To say something that would reframe the shape of the last 5 minutes into something survivable. Some strategic necessity she hadn't been told. Some temporary arrangement. Something. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the small scar at the edge of his jaw, where he'd caught a blade in his first border war. She had touched that scar. She had learned its story. She had believed, with the particular idiot faith of someone who mistakes proximity for intimacy, that knowing the scar meant knowing the man. "Celine," he said. His voice was quiet now, private, like he was doing her the courtesy of ruining her in a smaller register. "Kyle," she said back. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that, somewhere deep below the cold thing and the hollow thing and the thing that was beginning to heat. "This is cleaner," he said, "for everyone." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the scar and the dark eyes and the alpha's seal and the particular way he held himself, which was the way of a man who had never genuinely considered that he might be wrong. "Is it?" she said. Not a question. "You were never Iron Moon," he said. "You know that. You've always known that. Your blood is—" He stopped, chose his words. "This pack needs a Luna it can recognize as its own." "I've lived here 6 years." "You've been housed here 6 years. It's not the same thing." It was a small sentence, and it cut like something surgical, precise and deep, because the worst quality of accurate observations was that they did not stop being accurate simply because they were cruel. She had been housed here. She had been a political asset wearing a woman's face, a symbol housed in the East Wing and taken out for formal gatherings and given a pillar to stand at and told to look like she belonged. She had been so careful, and none of it had mattered at all. "And the exile?" she said. Her voice was very quiet now. "Are you going to tell me yourself, or am I going to hear it from someone else?" Something shifted in his eyes, something that might, in a more honest man, have been shame. "The Black Hollow Forest," he said, "by order of the Alpha and ratified by the Elder Council. You leave at dawn. The Black Hollow Forest, the Forbidden Wilderness, the place where—" Celine had been told this as a child, had heard it again and again in every corner of every pack she'd ever passed through. No wolf who entered had ever come back out. Some packs used it as a curse, some used it as a warning. The elders of Iron Moon used it as a boundary on their maps and drew no roads near it, and never spoke of what lived inside. He was sentencing her to death. They both knew it. "The Elder Council ratified it," she said. "Unanimously," he said. "Of course they did." She almost laughed. The heat below the cold thing was rising. She had a sense, a distant, technical sense, that she was going to need to be careful with it. That letting it out in this room, surrounded by 300 wolves who had just watched her be unmade, would be the last mistake she ever made. She held it down. She held it with both hands. "Tell me something, Kyle. Just one thing. Tell me if any part of tonight was honest. Not the politics. I understand the politics. The 6 years. Was any of it real?" He looked at her. His jaw was set. The scar sat at its familiar angle. "Go to sleep, Celine," he said. "It's a long walk at dawn." He turned and walked back toward the dais. She watched him go. 300 wolves watched her watch him go. And in the heat of the held thing inside her, in the center of the controlled, careful blaze she had been managing since the moment Lyra Vale walked through that door, something made a sound. Not external, nothing anyone else could hear, but internal, deep and structural. The sound of something that had been compressed for a very long time, finally reaching its limit. She kept it off her face. She kept her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes empty. She was the last of the Crimson Fang bloodline. She had been surviving long before Iron Moon. She would survive this too. She just didn't yet know what she would be when she came out the other side. They gave her a room to spend her last night in, at least. Not her room. They'd moved her out of the Luna's quarters within the hour, with a speed that made clear this operation had been planned well in advance, planned while she ate her meals and attended her duties, and held herself to the standards of a position that had already been quietly evacuated around her. The room they gave her was small and cold, in the lower east wing, with a single window that faced the tree line of the outer territory. A pack servant brought a pack of supplies, traveling rations, a heavy cloak, boots with reinforced soles, practical, efficient. The mercy of wolves who wanted their conscience clear. Celine sat on the edge of the cot and did not sleep. Outside the window, the moon was 3/4 full, pouring silver light onto the Iron Moon's outer walls. She watched it move through the sky, and she thought, with the particular precision of a mind that had decided to be useful rather than just hurt, about what she knew. She knew the Black Hollow Forest began 40 miles east of the capital, past the last border post and through the dead marshlands that no pack claimed. She knew the stories: ancient beasts, corrupted territory, ground that swallowed light. She knew that exile to the Black Hollow was not a punishment with an end date. It was execution with extra steps. Kale understood that. The elders understood that. The pack understood that. She also knew, and this was the piece she turned over carefully, handling it the way you handled something sharp, that she was not the kind of wolf who had ever operated only on what she was told. Her bloodline, the Crimson Fang, had been declared dead 3 generations back. A great war, a great defeat, a pack scattered and erased. That was the official history. That was what every elder in every territory recited when they cataloged the dead bloodlines, and they recited it in a tone of settled finality, the way people spoke of things they were glad had stopped. But Selena's grandmother, in the last year of her life, had said something that did not match the official history. She had said it once, late at night, in the thin-walled house on the edge of the border territory where Selene had grown up after her parents were killed in a land dispute. She had said it the way very old people sometimes said important things, sideways, wrapped in other words, easy to miss if you weren't listening for it. She'd said, they called it a defeat, but you can't kill what doesn't agree to die. Selene had been 12. She had filed the sentence away in the place where she kept things she didn't yet understand and waited for the context that would make them make sense. Sitting in this small, cold room with 40 miles between her and the place they were sending her to die, she thought about that sentence for a very long time. A sound outside the door, soft, deliberate. She was on her feet before she consciously decided to move. 6 years in Kyle's court had made her reflexes what they were. And she crossed the room in 4 steps and pressed herself to the wall beside the doorframe. The door opened. Mara slipped through it. Mara was 17, the youngest of the pack's healers in training, and the only person in Iron Moon who had ever treated Selene with the unguarded warmth of someone who had not calculated whether it was strategic to do so. She had a healer's soft hands and a warrior's direct eyes, and right now those eyes were red at the edges, and her mouth was a thin line. You have about 4 minutes before the night rotation passes this corridor, Mara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. So I need you to listen. I'm listening, Selene said. Mara crossed to the pack of supplies the servants had left and crouched beside it. From inside her healer's satchel, she pulled items quickly, efficiently, tucking them into the pack with practiced hands. A small glass jar of wound salve, 2 packets of fever root, a folded piece of oilskin, a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath. The knife was my father's, Mara said without looking up. He was a hollow scout 20 years ago, Pack Aldrich, before they disbanded. He went in once, came back out, and he would never talk about what he saw in there. She paused. He kept the knife under his pillow every night until he died. Mara's? Don't. Sharp, quiet. Don't thank me and don't argue with me. You have 3 minutes now. She finished with the pack and stood and turned and looked at Selene with the full weight of those red-edged eyes. I need to tell you something, and I need you to believe me even though I can't prove it. Tell me. Lyra didn't just come back, Mara said. She was sent for. 6 weeks ago, Kyle sent a rider to the Southern Territories. I only know because I was treating Elder Harrow's gout, and Harrow talks when he's in pain, and he doesn't always remember who's in the room. Her voice was very controlled. They planned this, Selene, the whole thing, the ceremony, the exile, the timing, all of it. Selene was quiet for a moment. The cold thing and the hot thing coexisted in her chest like 2 weather systems pressed against each other. The Black Hollow, she said. Has anyone actually been there recently? Anyone who came back? Mara's expression shifted. Something complicated moved through it. Not quite fear, not quite knowledge, but the look of someone who had a piece of information they were deciding how to carry. There are old texts, Mara said carefully, in the healer's archive, the ones that nobody catalogs and nobody reads. Pre-war documents from before the Crimson Fang Wars, before the histories got cleaned up. She met Selene's eyes. The Black Hollow wasn't always cursed. It was sacred. It was the ancestral territory of the Crimson Fang bloodline. A beat. Your bloodline. The room was very quiet. They didn't exile you to a place to die, Mara said. I don't think they fully understood what they were doing. Or maybe Lyra did. Maybe that's the whole play. She reached out and gripped Selene's forearm, brief and hard. I don't know what's in that forest, but I think I think it might know what you are. A sound in the corridor. Both of them froze. The footsteps of the night rotation passed the door, paused for one sickening second, and moved on. Mara released her arm. Time, she said. Mara. Celine caught her wrist before she could move to the door. After tonight, you need to keep your head down. Whatever I am, whatever happens in that forest, you are not a part of this. Don't make yourself a target. Mara looked at her for a long moment. I am a healer, she said quietly. I don't pick sides. I just try to make sure the right people survive. She pulled her wrist free gently. Survive, Celine, that's all. Just survive long enough to find out what you actually are. She was gone before Celine could answer, slipping out the door and closing it without a sound. Celine stood in the cold room under the three-quarter moon and picked up her father's knife, this dead man's knife, from a dead pack who had gone into the hollow and come back changed. And she held it in both hands and she thought about sacred ground and dead bloodlines and the particular obstinacy of things that refused to agree to die. She did not sleep. Dawn came gray and cold, with the kind of wet that settled into your clothes before you noticed it was there. They did not give her a formal send-off. That would have required someone to watch. The pack sergeant who came to escort her to the eastern gate was a man named Davin, middle-aged, built wide, with the face of someone doing a thing they would prefer not to be doing. He didn't speak to her. He walked 3 paces behind her through the back corridors of the compound, avoiding the main halls, taking the route used for maintenance workers and supply wagons, and Celine understood with the flat, functional clarity of someone who had already processed their grief that this too was planned. The route that no one had to see, the exit that let the pack pretend the whole business was already over. They passed through the kitchen corridor. 2 cooks were already working, heads down, hands busy. Neither looked up. They passed through the storage hall. Empty. They crossed the outer yard. The eastern gate was a heavy timber structure, iron-banded, built for practicality rather than ceremony. 2 guards stood at it. Neither of them was anyone Celine knew well. Neither of them looked at her. Davin stopped at the gate and produced a single folded document, her exile order, she assumed, formally stamped. He didn't offer it to her. He tucked it back in his coat. 40 miles east, he said to a point slightly to the left of her head. Past the Aldrich marshlands. You'll find the tree line before dark if you move steady. I know, she said. The gate closes behind you, he said. It won't open again. I know that too, she said. He stepped back. The gate mechanism groaned. She pulled the heavy cloak tighter, adjusted the pack on her shoulder, and felt the weight of the hunting knife at her hip. She thought about her grandmother's house on the border territory. She thought about the sentence spoken sideways in the dark. They called it a defeat, but you can't kill what doesn't agree to die. She walked through the gate. It closed behind her with a sound like a verdict. The marshlands took most of the morning. Celine moved fast and kept her mind focused on the ground in front of her feet. The wet season had been heavy. The marsh paths she found on old instinct were half submerged, the reliable, firm earth reduced to shifting islands of grass and mud. And twice she went in over her boots and had to haul herself out with her hands in the reeds. She was soaked to the knee within the first mile, and it stayed that way. She did not think about the haul. She did not think about his face or the particular quality of his voice when he said, "Go to sleep, Celine." She put those things in a room in the back of her mind, and she closed the door and she moved. A wolf without a pack was already dead. She had heard this her whole life, but Celine Vera had, in the truest sense, never had a pack. Her parents were dead before she formed memory. Her grandmother raised her alone in a border house. She had come to Iron Moon not as a daughter of that pack, but as a symbol of an old alliance, a placeholder, a piece on a board. What she'd had was a position, and positions were conditional. She understood now, with the marsh water cold in her boots and the sky pressing gray overhead, that she had always been moving toward this moment. That the exile was not something that had happened to her life. It was the moment her actual life began. This thought was not comforting, but it was useful. She held on to useful. By midday, the marsh gave way to harder ground, scrubby and pale, dotted with the skeletal trees she'd been told marked the outer boundary of unclaimed territory. The air changed slightly here, drier, colder, with a quality that reminded her of high altitude even though she wasn't climbing. Her ears caught nothing but wind and the distant call of a bird she didn't recognize. No movement, no tracks. The eastern sky, as afternoon came on, was beginning to darken in a way that had nothing to do with weather. The black hollow forest. She saw it the way you saw a storm front, not as a distinct thing you could point to, but as a quality of the horizon, a deepening, a thickening of light into something else. The tree line, when she finally reached it as the sun began its fall, was nothing like the forest edge she'd grown up knowing. Those were places where light broke around trees, where you could still see sky between branches, where the world went from open to dappled. This was a wall. Dark trees, old beyond reckoning, packed so dense that the interior was an almost solid black, even in what remained of the afternoon light. The bark was the color of dried blood. The branches above locked into each other like fingers, forming a canopy that let through almost nothing. Silence pushed out from between the trees like something physical. Celine stood at the edge for a long moment. She thought about what Mara had said. Sacred. Ancestral territory. Cursed was a word people used for places they were afraid of, places they wanted to warn others away from. Sometimes the warning was honest. Sometimes it was designed. She stepped over the tree line. The cold hit her immediately. A cold that was different from the marsh cold, different from the winter cold she knew. This was older. This was the cold of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. The sound of the outside world cut off so abruptly that it felt like a door closing, and the silence inside was the most complete she had ever heard. No bird, no wind movement in the upper branches, no drip of recent rain off leaves, nothing. Just her own breathing, which sounded very loud. She moved deeper. The trees grew larger as she went, their trunks widening to the diameter of small buildings, their roots heaving the ground into ridges and valleys that made movement slow and deliberate. The light continued to diminish. She pulled the oilskin Mara had packed and wrapped it around her shoulders over the cloak, and she moved by feel as much as sight, testing the ground ahead with her boots before committing her weight. Twice she heard movement in the dark between the trunks, something large, circling at a distance. She kept moving and kept her breathing even and kept her hand near the knife hilt, but didn't draw it. Not yet. Drawn steel was an escalation. She wanted information before she escalated. She moved for 3 hours. The sky above the canopy went from gray to black. She found the ruins by smell, which was the only way anyone could have found them. It was subtle. The smell of worked stone, of old charcoal, of the particular mineral dust that came from masonry exposed to centuries of weather. She angled toward it, and the trees thinned slightly as she descended into a shallow valley. And then the ground leveled and the trees opened just enough, and she saw it. Buildings, old buildings, enormous and broken, reclaimed by the forest over what must have been generations. Walls standing to half their original height, collapsed towers reduced to scattered stones, archways thick with vines but still structurally present, their shapes suggesting something that had once been designed for grandeur. The central structure, what remained of it, rose to perhaps 30 feet, its walls intact on 3 sides, its roof long gone, but its bones strong. Wolf clan architecture, the old kind, the kind that preceded the modern pack systems. Crimson Fang architecture. She recognized it from the one sketch her grandmother had kept, folded inside the cover of the household record book. She had looked at that sketch so many times as a child that its lines were carved into her memory. She stood in the ruins of her own ancestral home, and she breathed and she let it mean what it meant. Then she started building a fire, because sentiment was secondary to survival, and she was cold and wet and exhausted, and whatever this place meant in terms of bloodline and destiny could wait until she had stopped shivering. She was feeding dry moss into the base of her small fire, half sheltered in the remains of a corner where 2 walls still met, when she heard it. Not movement this time. Not the circling thing in the dark. Something different, closer, faster, and not trying to hide. She had the knife out and was on her feet in the same motion. 3 of them came out of the trees, massive, each one the size of a heavy horse, their shapes wrong in the way of the corrupted things that sometimes came out of dead territories. Their coats were mottled gray and black, their eyes reflecting the small firelight in flat yellow discs, their movements carrying that particular liquid quality that meant predators who had been hunting together long enough to move as one organism. Rogue wolves, corrupted. The kind that had been in the dead territories long enough to lose most of what made a wolf and retain mostly the hunger. They spread apart as they emerged, one to her left, one directly ahead, one circling to the right. A coordinated cutoff. They had done this before. Celine tracked all three with her peripheral vision and held the knife in a stable grip and did the math that her body knew how to do. 3 against 1. She was tired. They were not. They were on home ground. She was not. The odds were not good. The one directly ahead lunged. She moved left and the massive body hit the ground where she'd been standing, and she drove the knife into its flank as it went past. Not deep enough. She felt the resistance of muscle. Not enough leverage in the angle. The blade skated across ribs rather than going in. It turned on her with a sound that was less a snarl than a sustained rumble, something more primordial than the vocalization of a wolf she'd ever known. The one on the right was already coming. She didn't have time to reset. She tucked and let it go over her, felt the impact of its body on her shoulder as it missed clean but not by much, came up swinging the knife in a short arc that caught its back leg as it passed. And then the left one was on her, and this time she didn't get clear, and the impact took her sideways into the old wall, and her head hit stone. The world went white. Not fully dark, just white and static, and the cold stone against her back, and the weight of something massive standing over her, its breath in her face. Damp heat, the smell of corrupted territory and old hunger. She was going to die here. Distantly, she was aware of the thought as something separate from herself. An observation made from outside the body, the way your mind sometimes stepped out of a crisis to note it clinically. She was going to die in the ruins of her ancestors' home, which was either deeply meaningful or deeply ironic, and she was too close to unconscious to determine which. But then something else happened. Inside her chest, not the cold thing, not the hot thing, not any of the carefully managed feelings she'd spent 6 years learning to contain. Something entirely new and entirely enormous moved. It moved the way tectonic plates moved, slowly, and with the certainty of forces that did not negotiate. It was old. It was older than she was, older than her grandmother's house, older than Iron Moon and its torches and its politics and its careful little cruelties. It was something that had been sleeping inside her for so long that she hadn't known it was there. The wolf above her felt it first. It stepped back. Both of them stepped back. The third one, still circling somewhere in the dark, went completely still. Celine pressed her hand flat against the ancient stone beneath her, and something moved out of the ground and into her palm, or maybe out of her palm and into the ground. She could not tell which direction it traveled, only that it traveled, only that it was moving through her like a current moving through water, finding the path it had always known. Her skin began to burn. Not painfully. Phosphorescent. The silver light that poured down from the gap in the canopy, where the trees had pulled back from the ruins, was flowing into her like something recognized returning home. And where it touched her hands, her arms, the lines of her collarbone, it left marks. Silver and permanent and radiating a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. The 3 corrupted wolves moved back until the dark swallowed them. And somewhere in the black hollow forest, from the east, from the west, from directions she didn't have names for, she heard them begin to answer. Not the corrupted ones. Others. Many others. Wolves waking up. Celine Vera lay against the ancient stone of her ancestors' hall, bleeding from her temple where it had hit the wall, glowing silver in the moonlight, listening to the forest breathe. Far away, impossibly far, 40 miles through marsh and dead territory, and the width of everything they had taken from her, the Iron Moon capital burned with torchlight. A man was planning a binding ceremony. A woman was measuring the fit of a Luna's crown. 300 wolves were sleeping soundly, confident that what they had exiled was already dead. They did not know. None of them knew that what the forest had been waiting for, what the ruins had been holding open all these generations, was not a fugitive. It was an awakening. And somewhere in the deepest dark of the black hollow, something ancient opened its eyes. The silver didn't fade when the sun came up. Celine had half expected it to, had told herself, in the gray pre-dawn hours while she sat against the old stone wall with her knees pulled to her chest and the knife across her thighs, that what had happened in the dark was a stress response, a trauma hallucination, the mind doing what minds did when they ran out of other options. She had told herself this with the flat conviction of someone who had survived 6 years in a court that ran on manufactured certainty, and she had almost believed it. Then the light came through the gap in the canopy and hit her forearms, and the marks were still there. Silver, fine as thread, tracing lines up from her wrists along the inside of her arms in patterns that were not random. They followed the architecture of something: muscle, vein, an older map she didn't have the key to yet. They did not hurt. They were warm, slightly, in the way a healed scar was warm. Present, settled, as if they had always been there and were only now visible. She looked at them for a long time. Then she stood up, checked her pack, rebuilt her fire from the embers, and heated water for the fever root Mara had packed. Because whatever was happening to her bloodline, she had hit her head on a stone wall last night, and her temple was crusted with dried blood, and her body needed maintenance before it needed answers. She drank the fever root and ate 2 strips of travel ration and did not let herself think about Iron Moon or the wine-dark dress folded in the corner of that small cold room, or the particular quality of Kyl's voice saying, "Go to sleep, Celine." She let the ruins exist around her instead, let herself look at them in daylight. They were larger than she'd registered in the dark, and the crisis of the corrupted wolves. The central structure, the hall, she thought, the primary gathering space of whatever this had been, was built from a stone she didn't recognize, dark gray with a faint metallic quality, slightly reflective in the morning light. The archways that remained intact were carved, not decoratively, functionally. The carvings were a language, dense and systematic, running from the base of each arch to the keystone. She didn't read it, she couldn't. But the shapes were familiar in the way that sometimes a word in a language you don't speak looks familiar because you know the alphabet. Her grandmother had kept one other thing besides the sketch: a small square of worked leather with 3 lines of script that she had told Celine very firmly and only once was not something to be read aloud. Celine had never been able to read it anyway. She had traced the shapes with her finger as a child because they felt important. The way certain things felt important before you had the vocabulary to say why. The shapes on the arches were the same script. She pressed her palm flat against the nearest arch, and the stone was warm, which stone that had been in shadow all night should not have been. She pulled her hand back. She filed it. She moved. She spent the first 3 days learning the forest. This was not a romantic or exploratory process. This was survival methodology. The kind her grandmother had taught her in the practical, unsentimental way of people who understood that the wilderness did not care about your feelings, but would absolutely use your ignorance against you. She mapped the ruins by walking their perimeter in expanding circles, marking the terrain, identifying water sources, cataloging what grew and what moved and what kind of silence meant nothing was wrong versus the specific silence that meant something large was deciding what to do. The Black Hollow was not cursed, she decided on the second day. It was defended. There was a difference. Cursed places were indiscriminate. They damaged whatever came near. This forest was selective. The corrupted wolves that had attacked her first night had not returned. The other sounds she'd heard in the dark, the ones that had answered the silver marks, the deep resonance moving through the tree roots, those were present but not aggressive. She felt them the way you felt a current in deep water. Directional, purposeful. On the 3rd morning, she found the first of them. She was following a water source east of the ruins when she heard the breathing, labored, uneven, the kind that came with injury or illness. She tracked it without hurrying, moving slow and low, using the tree cover, until she found the wolf lying in a shallow depression between 2 massive root systems. Female, she estimated from the build, large but not one of the corrupted ones. Regular wolf coloring, tawny and gray, but lean in the way of prolonged stress. Her left hind leg was badly torn. Something had gotten there 2 or 3 days ago, and the wound was infected, hot to the touch, the surrounding flesh swollen and tight. The wolf tracked her with yellow eyes as she approached. Every muscle was ready to bolt or bite. Celine went very still and kept her hands visible and lowered herself slowly to a crouch, bringing her eyes to the wolf's level. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. Her voice was low and even. "I know you don't know that yet." The wolf's lip lifted, a warning. "I know," Celine said. "Everything in this forest looks the same to you right now. I understand that." She unslung her pack slowly, found the wound salve Mara had packed, and set it on the ground between them. Then she sat back on her heels and waited. This was also something her grandmother had taught her, though not about wolves. About people. About the ones who had been hurt enough that trust was not a concept they could access anymore, only a test they ran over and over against everyone who came near. You sat with them. You didn't move faster than they could handle. You let them run the test as many times as they needed. It took 40 minutes. The wolf's breathing gradually slowed. The rigid line of her spine gradually released. She did not approach Celine, but she stopped tracking her as a threat and started doing something else. Something Celine felt more than saw. A subtle shift in the quality of attention. Recognition, maybe. Or the early edge of it. Celine dressed the wound without rushing, moving only when the wolf's body language allowed it, stopping when it didn't, talking the whole time in the low, even voice she'd used from the start. Not to communicate information, just to fill the space with sound that was familiar and warm rather than silent and predatory. When she was done, she sat back and looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at her, and the silver marks on Celine's forearms had been warm for the last 40 minutes in the specific way of something activated rather than ambient. "Okay," Celine said. "Now we know each other." The wolf exhaled through her nose. Not a threat. Something else. That evening, when Celine returned to the ruins, the wolf was 12 feet behind her, moving with a slight hitch on the mended leg, tracking her the way something tracked something it had decided to follow. That was the first one. By the end of the second week, there were 11. She did not call them. She did not command them. They arrived in ones and twos and took up positions at various distances from the ruins, and each time one arrived, she felt it. The warm activation in her marks, the deep resonance in the root system, as if the forest itself was keeping account. Some of them she could approach. Some kept their distance, and she let them. They were all lean, all carrying the particular wariness of long-term exposure to the corrupted territory, all functional in a way the corrupted wolves were not. They had stayed themselves. That mattered. She trained with the knife every morning. An hour at dawn, working patterns her body remembered from before Iron Moon, from the border territory where Celine's grandmother had known a retired pack enforcer named Cade, who had agreed, for reasons he never fully explained, to teach a 12-year-old girl how to make herself difficult to kill. Cade had not been gentle about it. He had taught her that technique was secondary to willingness, that the deciding factor in most fights was not skill, but the moment where one party decided they were going to do what needed to be done before the other party was ready for them to do it. She trained until her arms were burning and her breath was coming in hard pulls, and the sweat had soaked through her shirt. And then she trained a little longer because the standard she'd been living to for 6 years was someone else's standard, and that standard had ended with her standing at an eastern gate while it closed behind her, and she was building new ones now. On the 15th day, she found the archive. It was below the main hall, a chamber accessed through a section of floor she'd been using to store her food pack, which she'd moved 2 days earlier when the root system beneath it had started to feel structurally uncertain. Pulling back the stone she'd used as a cover, she found not a root system but a set of steps, carved from the same dark reflective stone as the hall above, descending into a chamber that smelled of old parchment and minerals, and something else she couldn't name. She descended with a torch she'd made from the oilskin wrap and a split branch, and the chamber opened around her into something that was not a storage room. It was a library. Shelves carved directly into the stone walls, still intact, holding row after row of bound documents. Some parchment, some worked hide, some a material she didn't recognize that was darker and stiffer and had aged better than either. The marks she'd seen on the arches covered every shelf frame in dense, systematic rows. She picked up the first document she could open without it disintegrating and carried it to the light and looked at it for a long time. The script was the same as her grandmother's leather square and the arch carvings. Dense, angular, built on a base alphabet of about 30 symbols that combined into complex compounds. She could not read it, but she had it memorized. The shapes, the recurring compounds, the structural logic of it, within 3 hours of sitting with the documents, because this too was something she'd learned. Not reading, pattern recognition, the thing underneath reading. She brought everything that was still intact up to the main hall and laid it out in order of condition and sat with it for the rest of the day, and then the next day and the day after that, working the pattern until the pattern started working back. It was on the 4th day with the archive that a word broke open for her. Just one. A compound she'd seen in every document, always in the same structural position, always preceding the densest passages. She recognized it not from the script, but from the shape of how it functioned, from its relationship to the text around it, title or category, or the name of a thing being described. She knew the word the way you sometimes knew things before you had the vocabulary to prove you knew them. Crimson, or something adjacent to it, something that meant the color of living blood, specifically as distinct from shed blood. The color inside, the vital color, the color of something ongoing rather than finished. She sat back and looked at the marks on her forearms in the afternoon light coming through the gap in the canopy. She understood, in the way of understanding that sat below language and was not improved by language, that the archive was not a historical document. It was an instruction manual, and it had been waiting here for a very long time for someone whose blood would let them begin to read it. On the 22nd day, she was not alone. She heard the approach from half a mile out. 2 sets of footsteps, human not wolf, moving with more confidence than anyone who knew this forest should have had. Not pack soldiers. Pack soldiers would have moved in a larger group and with less certainty, and the Iron Moon scouts she'd known had a particular heavy-footed quality that came from boots built for territory defense rather than tracking. These two moved like they knew where they were going. She was at the tree line of the ruins' outer boundary when they came out of the forest, and she had the knife drawn and her back to the nearest large trunk, and 11 wolves arranged in a loose arc behind her at various distances, visible to anyone who looked. The 2 people stopped at the edge of the ruins and looked at her. One was a man she didn't know, mid-20s, dark, lean, with the build of a long-distance runner and the eyes of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had decided to stop showing it. The other was a woman around 40, weathered and steady, carrying a pack that was worn in the way of someone who had been traveling for weeks. She had a healer's kit on her right hip, military style, the kind that got worn on long missions. The woman raised her hands palm out. The man did the same. "We're not Iron Moon," the woman said. Her voice was flat and direct, no wasted warmth. "My name is Voss. This is Ren. We came from Pack Aldrich territory." Pack Aldrich. Disbanded. That was what Mara had said about her father. Pack Aldrich, before they disbanded. She kept the knife where it was. "Pack Aldrich dissolved 20 years ago," Celine said. "What's left of it did," Voss said. "About 30 families. We've been in the Eastern Territories since. Off the maps." Her eyes tracked the wolves behind Celine with the careful attention of someone doing a calculation. "We heard you were exiled. We've been moving since the 4th day." "You came here on purpose," Celine said. Not a question. "We came here looking for the Crimson Fang," Voss said. "We've been looking for a long time." Something shifted very slightly in the quality of the air. One of the wolves behind Celine took 3 steps closer without her signaling anything. "There is no Crimson Fang," Celine said. "That's the official history." "The official history," Voss said, and the flatness in her voice carried a specific weight that was not quite contempt but was adjacent to it, "was written by the people who wanted it to be true." She held Celine's gaze without challenge, just steadiness. "We watched them take your title in the hall. We had a contact inside Iron Moon, supply chain. She moves goods in from the Eastern Territories and she keeps us informed. She told us the moment they announced the exile." A pause. "No one comes out of the Black Hollow. That was what we were taught. That was what we believed. And then you didn't die, and we thought, maybe the stories were wrong about more than one thing." Celine lowered the knife. Not the whole way. Part way. "What do you want?" she said. "To not be hiding anymore," Voss said, "and to be on the right side of what's coming." "What do you think is coming?" Voss looked at her, at the silver marks, at the wolves arrayed behind her, at the ruins of the hall beyond. "The same thing that always comes," Voss said quietly, "when the wrong people have held the wrong power for too long and the ground finally runs out of patience." Ren, who hadn't spoken yet, turned his head to look at Voss with an expression that said he'd heard this speech before and still believed it. Celine looked at both of them for a long moment. She thought about 30 families in the Eastern Territories, off the maps, waiting for something they could follow. She thought about the archive below the hall and the instruction manual written in blood-colored language, and the 11 wolves in the trees behind her who had come from nowhere because something in them recognized something in her that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. She thought about Mara's father and his knife and his nightmares, and how he had gone into this forest and come back changed. "How far are your people?" she said. "4 days east," Voss said. "If we move steady." Celine looked at the ruins. At her fire, banked low, the archive documents waited with stones against the morning wind. At the work she'd barely started. "I'm not leaving here yet," she said. "There are things in this place I need to understand before I walk out of it." Voss nodded once. "Then we'll wait." "You'll work," Celine said. "If you're here, you're useful. I need someone who can read the old script, the pre-war Crimson Fang language. I've been pattern mapping it for days and I have a base, but I need more." Voss and Wren exchanged a look. "Wren reads it," Voss said. "Imperfectly. His grandmother was Crimson Fang, border territory. She taught him what she remembered." Celine looked at Wren. "How imperfectly?" she said. "Enough to get the bones," he said. His voice was quieter than Voss's, more careful. "The exact grammar is gone, but the primary vocabulary, the structural compounds, the titles and the law language, that I know." "Then you start tomorrow," Celine said. "The archive is below the main hall. There are 30-odd intact documents. I need the ones that deal with succession law and territorial sovereignty first." Wren blinked. "You found the archive. Is that surprising?" "People have been looking for this site for 40 years, he said. Not with accusation, with a flat, slightly stunned reverence. Pack Aldrich, 3 other dissolved clans, everyone who still believed the Crimson Fang territory was real and not just a legend. He looked at the ruins, at the carved arches, at the dark reflective stone in the afternoon light. "We thought it might be here. We weren't certain." "It's here," Celine said, "and the archive is intact, which means whoever preserved it knew someone was coming who would be able to use it." She picked the knife fully and sheathed it. "Make camp on the east side of the ruins. Stay out of the main hall until I've gone through the rest of what's in there. The wolves won't bother you as long as you don't do anything fast near them." Voss almost smiled. "You give orders like someone who's been doing it longer than 3 weeks." "I've been doing it 6 years, Celine said. "I just wasn't doing it for myself." 3 more people arrived on the 6th day of Voss and Wren's presence, then 7. Then, at the end of the 4th week in the Black Hollow, a group of 19 came out of the eastern trees in the early morning, led by an older man named Garin, who walked with a permanent lean from an old wound and had the specific quality of someone who had spent decades keeping a community alive by sheer refusal to accept that it was ending. The wolf count had reached 34. Celine worked the archive with Wren every morning from first light to midday, building the translation layer piece by piece, and what emerged from the documents was not history in the sense she'd been taught. History, as she'd been taught it, was the past, fixed, finished, a record of what had been and could not be changed. What the Crimson Fang archive contained was more like a set of standing instructions, a governance structure designed to be dormant, a legal and territorial claim written in language that was specific about conditions. When these marks manifest, when these wolves answer, when this land recognizes this blood, the claims are not historical. They are current. They are active. She read this passage 3 times while Wren watched her face. "What?" he said. "The exile," she said. "Kael's exile order. He sent me here and called it punishment." "Yes," Wren said carefully. "He sent me to the exact location that activates the Crimson Fang succession protocols." She looked at Wren. Either someone told him that and he didn't understand what he was being told, or no one told him because no one alive fully understood what this place was anymore. A pause. "Which is it?" Wren was quiet for a moment. "The second one," he said. "The knowledge was fragmented, split between the dissolved packs deliberately, I think. So no single group held enough to reconstruct the whole picture. Pack Aldrich had pieces. The others had pieces. The full picture only existed if someone found the archive. And found the archive at the right time," Celine said. "And had the blood to open it," Wren said, his eyes going briefly to the marks on her forearms. She turned back to the document. "How many people know this?" she said. "How many people outside of your group understand what the Crimson Fang succession protocols actually mean?" "A handful of elders in the dissolved packs," Wren said. "Fragments only, and 1 other person." The way he said the last sentence sat differently. Who? She said. He was quiet for one beat too long. Lyra Vale, he said. Her mother was Pac Aldrich. She grew up with the fragments, different pieces than we had. Her family's branch held the military protocols, the sovereignty enforcement clauses. He met Celine's eyes steadily. I think she knew where Kael needed to send you. The silence in the archive chamber was the most complete Celine had heard since her first night in the forest. She sat with this information and let it fully arrange itself. Lyra Vale, who had returned to the capital at exactly the right time, who had moved with the ease of someone executing a plan, not improvising, who had whispered in Kael's ear the name of the place to exile the last Crimson Fang heir, knowing or half-knowing what the place would do to her. But the documents in front of her were precise on one point above all others. The succession protocols did not specify the heir would survive. They specified the heir would be tested. The Black Hollow was the testing ground. The corrupted wolves, the brutal cold, the near-fatal attack on that first night, those were not accidents of a cursed landscape. They were the mechanism. Lyra had sent her here to be killed by the test. Celine was still alive. She turned this over carefully, the way you turned a stone over when you weren't sure what was living underneath it. Lyra had sent her here expecting one outcome. She had produced another, which meant Lyra's plan had a failure mode built into it, a contingency that depended on Celine not surviving and that had no architecture for what happened if she did. Does Lyra know the succession protocols activate on survival? Celine said. Ren's jaw was tight. I don't know. The fragments were imprecise about the conditions. She may have understood the location as simply fatal, not as conditional. Then she doesn't know, Celine said. She thinks I'm dead. Most likely, Ren said. Kael thinks I'm dead. Iron Moon hasn't sent any follow-up parties. Our contact confirmed it 2 weeks ago. They sent exile papers to the Elder Council as fulfilled, closed the file. Celine looked at the marks on her forearms in the light of the archive torch. Living blood, the document had said. Vital color. Something ongoing rather than finished. Good, she said. Leave it that way. Tep. On the 41st day in the Black Hollow, she made her first real mistake. She'd been pushing the training hard. Knife work in the mornings, then tactical work with Garen, who turned out to have been a border enforcer for 15 years before Pac Aldrich dissolved, and who understood the geometry of territorial conflict better than anyone she'd met. He was teaching her to think in 3 dimensions about it, to see terrain not as landscape, but as leverage, to look at a map of fractured Pac territories and read the pressure points the way a healer read a body. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. It was the thing they'd used her for at Iron Moon. Kael would bring her into strategy sessions when he needed someone to read a situation from outside the Pac's assumptions, and she would see the angles he'd missed and offer them in careful, measured language. Careful and measured, because she knew that the appearance of being less than she was the only protection she had. She did not need to appear less than she was anymore. This was intoxicating in a way she hadn't anticipated, and that was where the mistake lived. She was running a tactical scenario with Garen and 4 of the Aldrich fighters, working through a 3-front territorial problem, and she was moving fast, pulling connections from the archive documents and Garen's border knowledge and the specific configuration of wolves and people she had in this camp. And she built a plan that was elegant and efficient, and then she looked at Garen's face and understood she had just laid out, in detail, a strategy for not just defending the Black Hollow, but for taking the Iron Moon capital. The silence around the scenario map was complete. She had not meant to go that far. She had been following the logic, and the logic had followed itself to its natural conclusion, and the natural conclusion was Iron Moon. Was Kael. Was the throne she had been stripped from, and the hall where 300 wolves had watched, and the eastern gate closing with a sound like a verdict. Garen was looking at her the way people looked at things that had exceeded their expectations in a direction that wasn't entirely comfortable. That's a war plan, he said. It's a contingency, she said. The word felt thin. Celine. Garen's voice was not unkind. He was 62 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years watching young wolves discover the shape of what they were. A contingency is what you're prepared to do. What you just walked us through. That's not preparedness. That's hunger. She held his gaze. Her jaw was tight. I know what they did to me, she said. Her voice was very even. I know you do, he said, and I know what you've built here in 40 days, which is something I would not have believed if I hadn't watched it happen. But I need you to know the difference between the force that holds people together and the force that drives the knife. He paused. One of them brings the dissolved packs home, the other one leaves a different kind of ruin. She was quiet for a moment. The wolves in the tree line were watching, as they often did. That low-level directional attention, the count the forest kept. Both of them start with survival, she said. Yes, Garen said, but they end in different places. And right now you're making the plan before you know which one you're actually following. She looked at the map, at the pressure points she'd identified, at the clean geometric logic of it. She rolled the map and put it face down. You're right, she said. It came out flat and cost something. We table it. Garen nodded once, no triumph in it. But that night, lying in the main hall with the archive documents stacked beside her and the silver marks warm on her skin and the sound of wolves breathing in the dark outside the broken walls, she thought about it. Not the plan. The hunger. Garen had named it, and he wasn't wrong about what it was, but he was wrong about what it meant. Hunger was not the same as cruelty. Hunger was the thing that kept you moving when everything said stop. The cold thing and the hot thing and the deep old current in the root systems and the marks that wouldn't fade, all of it was the same force, the same consolidated pressure, and it was not asking her to be gentle. It was asking her to be accurate, to not mistake patience for passivity, to understand the difference between waiting for the right moment and pretending the moment wasn't coming. She had been housed somewhere for 6 years, being patient and careful and invisible. She was done being housed. 40 miles away in the Iron Moon capital, where the torches burned through the night and a binding ceremony was less than 2 weeks off. Someone was wearing her title. Someone was sleeping in the room she had not been permitted to make her own. Someone had taken the thing she had spent 6 years earning the right to, and that someone did not know, could not yet imagine, that the woman they had sent to die was lying awake in the ruins of an empire older than Iron Moon's entire recorded history, reading the legal documentation of her own succession, with 34 wolves and 43 people who had been waiting decades for something worth following, and marks on her skin that the ancient stones had put there because the blood recognized the ground, and the ground recognized the blood. The mistake was not the hunger. Garen was wrong about that. The mistake was showing it before it was time. She filed that too. On the 43rd day, Voss came to her at the tree line where she'd been sitting with the tawny wolf, fully healed now, who had not left the ruins in 3 weeks, and her face had the specific quality of a person carrying news they don't want to carry. Celine saw it from 20 feet away and stood up. Tell me, she said. Contact from Iron Moon, Voss said. Came in an hour ago through the Eastern Courier route. She held out a folded paper. Not sealed. Torn open already, which meant Voss had read it and made the decision to bring it to Celine anyway instead of managing it, which told Celine something important about Voss's character. She took the paper. The handwriting was Mara's, small, precise, healer's hand. She read it once, then again. The binding ceremony had been moved. Not postponed, accelerated. It was happening in 4 days, not 11. No reason given in official communications, but Mara wrote, Lyra pushed for it. No one in the council opposed. The elder Harrow specifically supported it. There is something else. I don't have it yet, but I think there is a second motion pending. Something about the Crimson Fang claim. Someone in the council raised it in closed session. I don't know what was said. I'm trying to find out. Below that in different ink, added later, Kael received something 3 days ago. He went into his private chamber for 2 hours and came out different. I don't know what it was. Be careful. Whatever is coming, it is coming faster than anyone is saying. Celine folded the paper. She thought about Lyra Vale, who had moved a binding ceremony 4 times faster than protocol required, who had pieces of the Crimson Fang succession documents and therefore understood at least partially the implications of time. Who knew that the exile window was closing? Lyra didn't think she was dead. Lyra knew she wasn't dead, or suspected it, which for a woman like Lyra was functionally the same as knowing. She was moving fast because she was trying to close a door before it opened, and she was trying to close it with the lock of a formal binding, a legal succession, a permanent installation of Iron Moon authority over the territories she needed to control. In the succession documents Ren had been translating, there was a clause that Celine had read 3 times and then set aside because she hadn't known what to do with it yet. The clause was specific: a Crimson Fang succession claim, once activated by bloodline markers. The silver marks, the wolf recognition, the territorial resonance superseded all other succession structures, including those ratified by pack councils, including formal binding ceremonies, if and only if the claim was formally declared before the competing succession was completed. Completed. Not started. Completed. 4 days. She looked at the tawny wolf, who had raised her head and was watching Celine with yellow eyes that held the specific quality of something waiting for a decision. She looked at the trees, where 34 wolves lived now, and at the camp beyond the ruins, where 43 people had been waiting for decades to come home. She looked at the silver marks, and they were very warm. "Voss," she said. "Yes," Voss said. She was already standing differently. She had already read the paper. She already knew. "Send word east," Celine said. "Tell Garen's contact in Pack Era and the Aldrich families who haven't come in yet. Tell them the timetable changed." Her voice was very level. The heat below everything was not rage anymore. It had refined into something more precise than rage, something that knew exactly what it was and where it was going. 4 days. Voss held her gaze. "You're declaring?" "I'm declaring," Celine said. "That changes everything," Voss said. Not a warning, a confirmation. "Everything already changed," Celine said. 43 days ago. I just took my time understanding it." She looked back at the ruins of the hall, at the dark, reflective stone in the afternoon light, at the carved arches and their standing instructions, at the place the ancient earth had been holding open since the last Crimson Fang heir had walked out of it and left it empty. She was done being empty. She turned back to Voss, and her eyes were clear, and the warmth in the silver marks was no longer the warmth of activation. It was the warmth of something locked, settled, final. "Get everyone together," she said. "We have 4 days to make them understand what's coming." And in the Iron Moon capital, 40 miles west, on the eve of a binding ceremony that a woman with sharp instincts and fragmented documents was rushing toward a finish line, she suddenly, in the marrow of her certainty, sensed she might not reach. A wolf howl went up from the Black Hollow forest. Long and clear, carrying through the night air over the marshlands and the border territories and the dead zones in between. It was the first sound Celine Vera had made since exile that was not designed to be invisible. It was answered within 60 seconds by 34 voices rising from the trees, then from further east, further north, further south. More voices, pack after pack of wolves who had been scattered and quiet for 20 years, who had felt the current moving through the root systems for 6 weeks and had been waiting to know if it was real. It was real. In the Iron Moon capital, a woman in a Luna's quarters sat up in the dark with her eyes wide and her hand around the fragments of an old document, and she said nothing. And she listened to the howling carry itself over the walls, and her face, in the darkness, looked for the first time like a person who had made a calculation error they could not correct. And in the ruins of the ancient hall, under the open sky where the silver moon burned cold and total overhead, Celine stood with her arms out and the marks blazing white, and the wolves around her and the ground warm beneath her feet with the heat of something that had been kept alive for generations underground. Waiting. Not for rescue. Not for permission. Not for anyone to decide her future for her. Waiting for her. She was here now. The howl hadn't fully died before Voss was moving. She crossed the ruins at a run, not the measured pace of someone executing a plan, but the hard, ground-eating stride of someone responding to something that had already changed. Celine turned from the tree line and read her face before she got within speaking distance. Not panic, Voss didn't panic, but the specific compression that happened to people who processed bad information fast and were already 3 steps into the response. "What?" Celine said. "Rider," Voss said, pulling up short. "Eastern route. Not our courier." Behind her, Ren was already at the camp's eastern edge, one hand on the knife at his belt, watching the tree line. Garen had come out of the main hall at the sound of running and was standing with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether to reach for a weapon. The rider came out of the trees on foot, which meant the horse had been left at the marsh edge. Smart, The marsh was impassable for horses in this season, and was moving with the deliberate control of someone who understood they were entering uncertain territory. Young, male, wearing travel clothes with no pack insignia, hands visible. He stopped 12 feet from Celine and looked at her with eyes that were doing their level best to stay neutral in the face of the silver marks, and the wolves, and the ruins, and everything else. "I carry a message for Celine Vera," he said, "from inside Iron Moon." "I'm her," Celine said. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed document, not Mara's small, precise hand on the outside. Something else, heavier paper. A seal she recognized and felt in her stomach before her mind fully processed it. Elder Harrow's personal seal. She took it. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at the writer. "Who sent you?" she said. "Elder Harrow," he said. "He told me to tell you. He said to say the debt is older than Iron Moon. He said you'd understand that." She didn't. Not yet. She filed it and broke the seal. The letter was short. Harrow wrote the way he spoke, precisely, without waste, every word load-bearing. She read it in under a minute, and the cold thing came back, the one she thought she'd converted into something more useful, and it arrived with a new quality she hadn't felt before. Not the cold of grief or humiliation, the cold of a floor giving way. She read it again to make sure she had it right. She had it right. Voss was watching her face. "Celine." "The declaration," Celine said. Her voice was very even. "The succession claim. We discussed it here, in this camp. Today." She looked up from the letter. Who knew? The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds and contained a full rearrangement of assumptions. Garen spoke first. Everyone in camp heard the howl, but the decision, that was you, me, Voss, Ren, and the 4 fighters running the scenario. "And your Eastern contact," Voss said. Her voice had gone flat and careful. "The message went east an hour ago." "It went east," Celine said, "and somehow Elder Harrow in the Iron Moon capital, 40 miles west, wrote this letter before the message went east. This seal was applied before the howl." She held up the letter. "Which means the information didn't travel east, it traveled west, before I made the decision." Another silence, a different shape than the first. She looked at the 4 fighters, at Garen, at Ren. Ren's face was doing something she couldn't fully read, and that was new. She could read Ren, had been able to for weeks. He was not a man built for concealment, and had never tried to be one around her. But right now there was a quality in his jaw and his eyes that was the look of someone who had known something was coming and had not said so. "Ren," she said. He held her gaze. He didn't flinch, which she gave him credit for. "Talk," she said. "I sent a preliminary message west," he said. 4 days ago, before your decision today, before the howl." The camp was so quiet she could hear the fire. "Explain that," she said, flat, cold. "There is a faction in the Elder Council," Ren said. His voice was controlled, and she understood he had been preparing this explanation for a while. "Not Harrow alone. 5 elders. They have been waiting for the Crimson Fang succession activation for 20 years. They want the claim declared. They want Iron Moon's authority structure challenged legally, through the old protocols, not through force." He paused. "I told them the activation had occurred, that you were alive, that the marks had come in and the wolves were answering. I told them because they needed to know, and because without a council faction supporting the declaration, a military action against Iron Moon would cost more lives than... You sent intelligence about my location, my status, and my capability to people inside the walls of the pack that exiled me," Celine said. "To people who want what you want," Ren said. "To people I have never met, inside a structure controlled by a man who sentenced me to die, based on your assessment of their intentions." She took 1 step toward him, and he didn't step back, which was either courage or stubbornness, and it didn't matter which. "You made that decision without asking me. If I had asked you, you would have said no," he said. "And we would have walked into a declaration with no council support and a military engagement we couldn't win. That was my call to make." "You've been in the forest 43 days, he said, and his voice had an edge now. Not aggression, but the friction of someone who believed what they were saying and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I've been watching the council politics for 20 years. I know which elders hold which debts, and which of them have been waiting for this moment since before you were born. I made a tactical decision with information you didn't have, and I stand by the decision. I don't stand by doing it without telling you. The distinction he was drawing was real, and she knew it was real, and that made it more infuriating, not less. "Read me the letter," Voss said quietly. Celine looked at her, then she read it. Harrow's message was 3 paragraphs. The first confirmed what Wren had said. 5 elders, prepared to recognize a Crimson Fang succession claim, prepared to formally challenge the Iron Moon binding ceremony on legal grounds if the declaration was made. The second paragraph listed what they needed: the declaration, the bloodline documentation from the archive, and physical presence at the border within 72 hours for a formal witnessing. The third paragraph was the one that had produced the cold floor feeling. Harrow wrote, "I must tell you what I could not tell you before. The exile order was not Kael's idea. Kael agreed to it and signed it, and I will not diminish his culpability for that. But the exile to the Black Hollow, specifically, that instruction came from Lyra Vale. What Lyra Vale knew, and what I failed to act on when I should have, is this. 6 months ago, Lyra approached the Elder Council in closed session and proposed a motion. The motion was to permanently dissolve the Crimson Fang succession protocols in Iron Moon law, to strike them from the territorial legal record entirely. The vote failed, 4-3. She did not accept the failure. The exile was her second approach to the same problem. I voted against the motion. I did not warn you. For that I carry a debt I cannot repay with a letter. What I can give you is this. Lyra knows the archive exists. She has known since before the exile. She did not send you here expecting the forest to kill you. She sent you here expecting to arrive before you found the archive and burn it. She is 3 days out." Celine lowered the letter. 3 days out. Not from the capital. 3 days from the Black Hollow. She had been building here for 43 days, moving carefully, working the archive, gathering people, building the slow architecture of something that could stand. And Lyra had been moving for 40 days, from a different direction toward the same point. And nobody in this camp had known it because the one person who had Western contacts had been managing the intelligence himself. She looked at Wren. He had read enough of her face to know she'd gotten to that paragraph. "I didn't know about Lyra moving," he said. "The council faction didn't tell me that." "Did they know?" Celine said. He was quiet for one beat. "I don't know." "Then your council faction," Celine said, "either withheld that information from you, or they didn't know because Lyra has assets in the council you didn't account for." She watched his face. "Which means your 20 years of reading those politics just got a great deal more complicated." He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The specific devastation of being correct about the goal and wrong about the ground was written in the set of his jaw. Garen had been quiet through all of this, processing in the way of someone who had survived long enough to know that the first 3 minutes after bad news were the worst time to speak. Now he said, 3 days. With what force? "The letter doesn't say," Celine said. "Then we assume enough," Garen said. "What does she want with the archive?" "She wants to burn it," Celine said. "If there's no legal documentation of the succession protocols, the declaration has no teeth. It's a bloodline claim with no institutional backing. Kyle's lawyers dissolve it in a session. The binding ceremony proceeds. The claim dies with the last heir before she can use it." She paused. "Me." 3 days, Voss said. "Not a repetition. A calculation." "We can't move the archive," Wren said. "Not in 3 days. There are 30-odd documents, some of them too fragile to transport at pace, and we don't have the materials to—" "We're not moving it," Celine said. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the ruins, at the dark reflective stone, at the archive below, and the standing walls and the carved arches with their instruction language, and the 43 people in this camp who had waited decades for something worth following, and the 34 wolves in the trees who had answered a call they weren't asked to explain. She had been building carefully. She had been patient. She had been taking the time to understand the ground before she moved on it, and that patience had been the right call, and she did not regret it. But patience had an endpoint, and the endpoint was not a choice she made. The endpoint was a woman 3 days out with fire, and a council faction that might be compromised, and a succession clock running down to a binding ceremony that was now 4 days away. The math was simple and brutal. She had 43 days of preparation. She had 3 days before the archive was ash. She had 4 days before the competing succession was legally completed, and her claim became historically interesting rather than legally actionable. She had to move now, with what she had, without the additional preparation she'd planned for. This was the thing Garen had been warning her about. Not the hunger, she understood that now. Not the desire for what she deserved, but the moment where the situation forced your hand before you were ready, and you had to decide in real time who you were when readiness wasn't an option. She turned to Ren. "Can you send word to Harrow tonight?" she said. "Yes," he said, quiet, still carrying the weight of what he'd done and not trying to put it down. "Tell him the declaration will be made," she said. "Tell him we need the witnessing at the northern border marker, not the eastern route, the northern. It's 2 days hard travel instead of 3, and Lyra won't expect the angle. Tell him to bring the council faction and tell them to come ready to work fast and in bad conditions." She paused. "Tell him the debt he mentioned. Tell him the way to pay it is to not be late." Ren nodded once. He moved. She looked at Garen. "I need numbers," she said. "Honest numbers. What can we move in 2 days? What condition will they be in when they arrive? And what's the wolf situation if we pull out of the hollow?" Garen looked at her steadily. He was 62 and he had been waiting 40 years for a cause worth burning his last good decade on. And his eyes said that he had found it, and he was not going to waste it by being sentimental about the difficulty. 43 people, about 30 fit to move at pace, he said. The other 13 can follow at 2 days behind. They're either too young or carrying old wounds. Wolves. That's not my read. That's yours. She looked at the tree line, at the tawny wolf who had been watching the entire scene from 20 feet away with a focused attention she'd come to understand was not passive, was deliberate, was the specific quality of something that had chosen her back. 34 wolves, 40 days of trust built in cold and dark and survival, and the deep current in the root systems that she now understood was not metaphor, was actual. Was the ancestral land recognizing the bloodline and responding the way a body responded to the return of something that had been cut out and was trying to reconnect? She pressed her palm flat to the earth the way she had on her first morning in the ruins. The warmth came immediately, and it was not quiet this time. It had the quality of something that had been waiting 43 days for her to stop building and start moving. "The wolves come," she said. "All of them." Garen accepted this without question. "Then we move tonight," he said, "in the dark. Lyra's people will expect us to wait for dawn." "Lyra's people," Celine said, and her voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not the careful flatness of 6 years at court, not the controlled precision of 43 days in exile, but something older and less managed, something that had been in the blood the whole time and was only now permitted to surface. "Don't know what we are yet." She turned from the ruins one final time. The archive was below her feet, the succession documents, the standing instructions, the proof of everything she was and everything they had tried to erase. She had memorized what she needed. Ren had translated the critical clauses. The physical documents mattered for the legal declaration. Harrow would need them. But what they contained, the knowledge itself, was already inside her, in the marks on her skin, and the warmth in the ground and the wolves in the trees. You could burn paper. You could not burn blood. She looked at Voss. "Get everyone up," she said. "Pack what we can carry fast. We leave in an hour." Voss moved without a word, and Celine stood in the ruins of her ancestors' hall for the last time, under the full weight of the silver moon, with the cold thing gone and the hot thing gone and something new in its place. Something that had no name yet because it had not existed until this moment, forged from 43 days of survival in one letter, and the particular violence of learning that the people you trusted had been making decisions in your name in the dark. She had come to this forest as something broken. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece in the cold and the silence, slowly and carefully and on her own terms. And now, with 3 days before fire reached the archive, and 4 days before the door closed permanently, she was walking out of the darkness with 30 wolves at her back and 40 fighters, and the legal architecture of a succession claim 2,000 years older than the man who had tried to bury her here. She was not ready. She had needed 2 more weeks, 1 more full translation pass, 3 more fighters from the Eastern families who were still 5 days out. She went anyway, because this was the thing the forest had been teaching her, in the language of corrupted wolves and cold stone and silver marks and root systems that hummed with ancestral memory. Survival was never the thing you did when you were fully prepared. Survival was the thing you did with what you had, in the time you were given, when everything said wait and your bones said now. Her bones said now. She walked out of the black hollow forest and did not look back. They moved through the night like something the dark had decided to release. Celine set the pace, and it was brutal. Not reckless, but the kind of hard, sustained movement that asked everything of a body and accepted nothing less. The marsh was treacherous in the dark, and she crossed it from memory and instinct, reading the ground through her boots the way her grandmother had taught her to read weather, not by looking directly at it, but by the quality of pressure it put back against you. Twice the path dissolved into water, and she redirected without stopping, cutting north and finding solid ground by feel. The 30 fighters behind her followed her line exactly. Nobody complained, nobody asked for rest. The wolves moved in the dark on both sides like shadows that had learned to breathe. Garen came up beside her at the 2-hour mark, matching her pace with the slight lean of his old wound. "Northern border marker is a day and a half at this speed," he said quietly. "People will be cooked." "They'll rest at the tree line before the marsh clears," she said. 2 hours. Then we push." He was quiet for a moment. "Harrow's faction. 5 elders. Kyle will know they've moved the moment they leave the capital." "I know. That gives us a window, and I can't tell you how wide it is." "Neither can I," she said. "So we move faster than the window closes." He accepted this and fell back. She thought about windows, about the specific mathematics of situations where every variable was moving and none of them were yours to control. She had spent 43 days in the forest learning patience, learning the difference between waiting and being passive, and she had come to understand that patience was not the absence of urgency, it was the management of it. The ability to hold urgency in your chest like a coal, keeping it hot without letting it burn through the thing containing it. The coal was burning very hot right now. They rested 2 hours at the marsh's northern edge, in the scrub cover where the ground was firm enough to lie down on. She did not sleep. She sat against a tree and watched the wolves settle around the perimeter. Not sleeping either, most of them. Alert in the particular way of animals that had learned the hard way that relaxed and alive were not always compatible. And she worked through the sequence in her head. Northern border marker, Harrow's faction, the declaration. The documentation from the archive, rolled in the oilskin at the center of her pack, which she had not let anyone else carry. Then Iron Moon, then Kyle. She had not let herself think past the declaration in any sustained way, because thinking past the declaration was the same as assuming it would succeed. An assumption was the luxury of people who didn't understand how many things could go wrong between planning and execution. But in the 2 hours of cold dark, while her people slept and the wolves kept their watch, she let herself think about it for exactly as long as it took to be honest with herself. She was going to have to face him. There was no architecture, no legal protocol, no succession document that would make that unnecessary. Whatever the declaration achieved, whatever the council faction ratified, Cale Thornhart was Iron Moon's sitting alpha with the pack military behind him and the instincts of a man who had held power long enough to believe it was structural rather than conditional. He would not step back from a legal ruling. He would respond to it the way he responded to everything he perceived as a challenge to his authority. She knew exactly how he responded to that. She had watched him for 6 years. She understood now with the flat clarity of someone who had run out of room for self-deception, loved him for some portion of those 6 years. Not wisely. Not well. With the specific blind faith of someone who had never had a stable structure to belong to and had confused proximity to power with the thing she was actually looking for. She did not love him now. What she felt now was far less confused and far more dangerous. The cold, accurate understanding of a person she knew completely, including every tactical tendency and every vulnerability, and the knowledge that she was going to have to use that understanding against him. This was not revenge. She was clear on that distinction in a way she hadn't been 3 weeks ago when she'd laid out the capital strategy and Garen had named the hunger in it. Revenge was emotional accounting, the attempt to balance a debt through pain. What she was doing was not accounting, it was correction. The removal of an error from a system that could not function correctly until the error was removed. She was clear on this. She picked up the pace again at first light. Harrow was already at the northern border marker when they arrived. He was a small man, Elder Harrow, compact and deliberate, with close-cropped white hair, and the kind of face that had spent 60 years being unreadable in rooms where being readable was dangerous. He stood at the border marker stone with 4 other elders ranged behind him, and 6 guards she didn't recognize. And when she came out of the tree line at the head of her column, he looked at her the way a man looked at a thing he had believed in theoretically for 20 years, and was now encountering in the actual, with all its sweat and silver marks and wolves. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You look like her." "Who?" Celine said. "Your grandmother," he said. "I knew her. Before the wars, before everything fell apart. She had the same—" He stopped, moved on. "We don't have much time. Kael's border patrol runs this marker every 6 hours. We have approximately 90 minutes. "Then let's use them," she said. What followed was the most compressed and consequential 90 minutes of her life. Ren produced the archive documents and spread them on the flat surface of the marker stone, weighted against the morning wind, and Harrow and the eldest of the other council members, a woman named Syra, 70-something, with a healer's precise hands and a border enforcer's eyes, went through them with the speed of people who had been waiting to read exactly these documents for a very long time. They spoke in low, urgent voices, cross-referencing, confirming, tracing the legal lineage of the succession protocols through the documented bloodline chain. Celine stood at the stone and answered questions when asked, and did not fill the silences with reassurance, because reassurance was not what this required. What it required was documentation and precision, and the 43 days of work she and Ren had done in the archive. At the 50-minute mark, Syra looked up from the documents and looked at Celine's arms. "Show me," she said. Celine pushed back her sleeves. The silver marks in the morning light were fully visible, detailed, architectural, running from wrist to elbow on both arms in the Crimson Fang script that she now partially read. Syra looked at them for a long time with the expression of someone confirming a calculation. Then she looked at the wolves ranged behind Celine and the camp followers, and Garen and Voss and Ren, and she looked at the old stone of the border marker, and she set down the document she was holding. "It's real," Syra said to Harrow, not with surprise, with the particular relief of a woman who had gambled a great deal on something being true. "It's real," Harrow confirmed. "Then we proceed," Syra said, and her voice was very final. The declaration took 11 minutes. Formal language, old language, the kind that had to be spoken aloud in front of witnesses to activate its legal standing in the territorial law that predated every current pact structure on the continent. Ren spoke the Crimson Fang portions. Harrow and Syra spoke the council portions. Celine spoke the Bloodline Declaration herself. In the old language she had been learning from the archive for 6 weeks, imperfectly but correctly enough. Ren had been rigorous about the critical phrases. When she finished speaking, the marks on her arms went from warm to burning, a brief flare that lasted 3 seconds, and then settled back to warmth. All of the wolves sat down simultaneously, which was not something she had asked them to do. Harrow looked at that and pressed his mouth into a line that was trying hard not to be something more. "It's done," he said. "The declaration is witnessed and will be filed with the full council record. Under territorial law, the Crimson Fang succession claim now supersedes the Iron Moon binding ceremony if executed within the statutory window." He paused. "That window is 60 hours. "I know," she said. "Kael will challenge it," he said. "Legally, militarily, directly. He will not accept the ruling." "I know that too," she said. Harrow looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she didn't fully classify before he put it away. "The debt," he said quietly. "Your grandmother. She trusted us to hold the knowledge until it was time. We held it, but we waited too long to act on it. I voted against Lyra's dissolution motion when it mattered. I did not warn you when it would have cost me something to do so." He paused. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. 60 years of careful political navigation and controlled expression and strategic silence, and here he was at a border marker in the early morning, saying the word sorry to a woman he'd watched be exiled and done nothing to protect. "Survive long enough to finish this," she said. "That's the debt paid." He nodded once. The guards began moving, packing the documents, preparing to return. She was turning back to her own column when the eastern tree line erupted. They came from the east and slightly north. a tactical angle that cut off the fastest route back toward the marshlands, which told her the approach had been planned with knowledge of her likely position. 20 fighters, maybe 25, moving in the hard, coordinated way of people who had been briefed and were executing, not improvising. No Iron Moon insignia, civilian gear with military training underneath it. Lyra's people. 3 days out, Harrow had written. It had been 41 hours. She had moved faster than expected. Celine filed this with a cold respect. Lyra was not someone who made one plan and hoped it held. She was someone who built contingencies and then executed the contingency before you'd finished responding to the original. Contact East, Garen said, already moving. He didn't need orders for this part. He had been here before. The next 45 seconds were the controlled chaos of a force that had trained together, reorganizing into a defensive configuration under contact pressure. And what Celine learned in those 45 seconds was that the 40 days in the forest had produced something she hadn't been able to measure until now. Her people moved like a unit. Not perfectly. Not with the polished efficiency of Iron Moon's standing military, but with the specific cohesion of people who had survived hard things together and trusted each other's judgment under pressure, which was in practical terms worth more than polish. The wolves did not wait for coordination. They moved on instinct, which was their nature, and their instinct was aligned with hers in a way that still had no language she fully trusted but was functionally undeniable. They hit the eastern tree line before Lyra's fighters fully cleared it, and the contact noise that followed was loud and immediate, and then very quickly became something other than a full engagement. Because even well-trained fighters, when they came out of a tree line into 34 wolves, made adjustments. Lyra's fighters were well-trained. They adjusted fast. But fast was not fast enough. The fighting was brief and brutal and close, the kind that happened when two forces met in a space too tight for tactics and fell back on will and physical fact. She was in it before she consciously decided to enter it, moving toward the eastern edge where the line was thinnest, knife out, operating on the Cade-taught methodology of making herself difficult to kill before making herself difficult to stop. A fighter came at her from the left, and she was already not where he expected her to be, and the knife caught him in the forearm as he tried to adjust, and he went down hard. Another came from behind, and she heard him before she saw him. Heavy footfall, the particular sound of someone committing weight downward. And she dropped and let him go over her and came up inside his reach and drove an elbow into his jaw, felt the crack through her arm, and then Voss was there and the line held. She was bleeding from somewhere. She didn't know where yet. Her body was running on a chemistry that postponed that information until it was relevant. The fighting lasted 11 minutes. When it stopped, 6 of Lyra's fighters were down and the rest had withdrawn into the tree line, which meant retreating for reinforcement or retreating for good, and she didn't know which and couldn't wait to find out. Garen appeared at her shoulder. He had a cut across his cheekbone that was bleeding freely, and his expression was the expression of a man doing rapid calculations. 4 of ours down, he said. Not dead. Hurt. They need time we don't have. She looked at her people, at the 4 who were down, being treated by the 2 fighters with basic field training, at the council faction, who had positioned themselves in the center of the formation with the archive documents and were unhurt, at Harrow, who was watching her with an expression that had moved past politics into something more fundamental. How far are we from the capital? She said. 20 miles, Garen said. Open territory, no cover. And Kale knows we're here, she said. Not a question. The moment Harrow's group left the capital, Kale knew, Garen said. He's been moving since before we reached this marker. She looked at the eastern tree line. No movement yet. The wolves were watching it. She looked at the archive documents in the oilskin pack. The declaration made. The witnessing complete. The legal claim now standing in the territorial record, for whatever the territorial record was worth against a sitting alpha with a military and the particular psychology of a man who had never been told no by something he could not override. The declaration was the legal foundation, but foundations did not hold without the structure built on top of them, and the structure required Iron Moon. Required walking 20 miles of open territory toward a man who now knew exactly where she was and what she had done and would be calculating right now whether to meet her in the field or wait for her at the capital. She already knew the answer. Kale did not wait. Kale met things head-on because head-on was the only register he understood. It was his greatest tactical strength and the thing she intended to use against him. She looked at her wounded. 4 people who had followed her out of a forest on 43 days of trust, who were now bleeding on open ground because of decisions she had made. She felt this. She did not put it in a room and close the door. She let it be present and real, and then she used it, not to hesitate, but to sharpen. Because people who did not feel the weight of what they asked of others were not leaders. They were users. The weight was the point. The weight was what kept you accurate. "We move in 10 minutes, she said. "The 4 who are down, can they walk?" "2 of them," Garen said. "The other 2 need carrying or leaving." "Nobody gets left," she said. 2 people on each. They rotate. "That cuts our speed by—" "Nobody gets left," she said again. Different tone. Final. Garen accepted it. She went to each of the 4 wounded herself, in the 10 minutes before they moved. Not to say anything meaningful. There wasn't time for meaningful. She crouched beside each one and made eye contact and said one thing, "I see you," that was all. It was what Cade had done when she was 12 and had taken her first bad hit in training and was sitting in the dirt wondering if the ground was where she lived now. He had crouched beside her and said, "I see you," and had not offered a hand up, because the point was not the hand up. The point was being witnessed. She understood that now in a way she hadn't at 12. They moved. Kael met them 8 miles from the capital. She saw the dust first, the signature of a mounted force moving at pace across open ground, and the specific quality of it told her the size before she could see the column. 50 riders at the front, infantry behind, the Iron Moon standard carried at the head, where it was always carried when Kael rode out personally. He had come himself. Of course he had. She kept moving toward it. Her 30 fighters pulled tight behind her, the wolves spreading wide on the flanks in the instinctive tactical positioning that still sometimes stopped her cold with how precisely it mirrored human military doctrine. The 4 wounded were in the center of the column, moving under their own power as much as possible. When the 2 forces were 400 yards apart, the Iron Moon column stopped. One rider separated from the front and came forward. She knew the silhouette before she could read the face. She walked out from her column to meet him. He stopped his horse 20 feet from her and looked down, and she looked up, and the 8 miles of open ground and the 2 armies and the legal declaration and the 43 days were all present in the space between them, all of it at once, compressed into the specific quality of 2 people who knew each other well enough to know exactly what the other one was capable of. He looked different from 43 days ago. Not older, something else. Tighter in the jaw, harder in the eyes. The specific compression of a man who had been managing a situation that had been refusing to resolve. He was still wearing the Alpha seal at his collar, still holding himself the way he always held himself, the way of a man who had never genuinely occupied a space without owning it. She noticed, because she noticed everything about him, that his hands on the reins were not entirely steady. "You should be dead," he said. His voice was the same. She had expected that to be harder than it was. "I know," she said. "I worked on it." He looked at the wolves on the flanks, at the silver marks on her forearms, visible in the morning light, at the people behind her, the ones she'd gathered and the ones she'd carried and the ones who had carried each other across 20 miles of open territory. "You declared," he said. "An hour ago," she said, "witnessed by 5 council elders and filed in the territorial record. The Crimson Fang succession claim supersedes your binding ceremony under pre-war territorial law. You know this. You have lawyers, they've read the same statutes. My lawyers," he said, "serve Iron Moon." "Your lawyers," she said, "serve whoever holds the authority they've sworn to uphold. When that authority changes, the lawyers follow." She held his gaze. "You know how this works, Kael. You've done it yourself 3 times in 6 years when you absorbed smaller packs. You used the legal architecture because it was cleaner than force and left fewer debts." Something shifted in his expression. Not concession, not even close, but the recognition of a person who was being spoken to by someone who understood the game at the same level he played it, and who was no longer pretending otherwise. "You were never this direct," he said. "I was exactly this direct," she said. "You just weren't listening." He looked at her for a long moment. The horse shifted under him. Behind him, 50 mounted Iron Moon warriors were waiting on his word, and behind her, 30 people who had bet their lives on something she was still in the process of becoming were waiting on the outcome of a conversation that would determine whether the next hour was legal or military. "The binding ceremony is in 3 days," he said. "The binding ceremony is void under the declaration," she said. "Your lawyers will tell you that by tonight." "My lawyers," he said, "will tell me what I decide they tell me." "Then you'll be making a decision in direct violation of territorial law that's been standing since before your grandfather's grandfather held a title," she said. "And every pack watching this, and they are all watching, Kael, every dissolved pack and every borderland clan and every elder who has been waiting 20 years for the Crimson Fang claim to activate, will see an alpha who chose force over law when the law stopped serving him." She paused. "That's not a legacy. That's a warning to every pack about what Iron Moon's word is worth." His jaw was iron. His eyes were doing the things she had learned to read over 6 years. The rapid internal calculation, the running of scenarios, the measuring of costs. She had watched him do this across strategy tables and in formal gatherings, and in the private moments when he thought she wasn't paying attention. And she had always been paying attention, had cataloged every tell, had filed it all in the place where she kept things she didn't yet have use for. She had use for it now. "Step down from the Alpha title," she said. "Allow the council to convene under the territorial protocols. The succession will be handled legally, with full documentation, in front of every pack that chooses to send witnesses." She kept her voice even and direct, and gave him nothing to point to as aggression or provocation. "That's the path that ends with something intact. Yours. Iron Moon's. The legacy you spent 30 years building." He looked at her. "And if I don't," he said. She looked back. The wolves on the flanks had gone completely still. The 30 people behind her were completely still. The 50 Iron Moon riders were completely still. Everything was waiting on the shape of what came next. "Then we find out," she said quietly, "which of us the ground recognizes." She held his gaze, and the silver marks on her forearms were burning, not painfully, with the heat of something that knew exactly what it was. And somewhere behind the Iron Moon column a sound began, low and deep, rising from the earth itself. The resonance of the territorial root system she had felt in the ruins and the archive and the moment of her declaration, spreading now outward from the land itself, because the land was not neutral, had never been neutral, had been holding a claim open for 200 years and was being asked now to make its position known. Kael heard it. She watched his face when he heard it. He was a man who had held power long enough to believe it was unconditional, and in the quality of his expression in this specific moment, the first crack in the certainty, the first genuine encounter with something his authority could not simply override, she saw something she had never seen in 6 years of watching him. Kael Thornheart was afraid. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and behind them both the two forces stood on open ground with the fate of every territory between them, balanced on whatever word came out of his mouth next. He drew his sword. The sword caught the morning light and threw it sideways. Celine did not step back. She had made a decision somewhere in the 43 days in the forest. Not a conscious decision, nothing she had sat down and reasoned through, but the kind that accumulated in the body over weeks of cold and survival and the repeated discovery that the ground did not swallow you when you held your position. She had made it 1,000 small times until it was no longer a decision but a fact of her architecture. She did not step back. Kael looked at the sword in his hand. She watched him look at it. Watched the calculation run. Not the tactical calculation, the other one, the deeper one that happened below strategy in the place where a person understood what their actions would mean in an hour, in a year, in the permanent record of what they had chosen when it cost them something. She had watched him run this calculation across 6 years, and she had always known, with the resigned clarity of someone who loved a person and was not blind about them, that Kael Thornheart's calculations always came out the same way. He measured cost in terms of power. What did this gain him? What did this preserve? What, in 20 years, would people say he had done? He was running it right now. She let him run it. Behind him, the 50 Iron Moon riders were very still. She could feel the quality of that stillness. Not the stillness of people awaiting an order, but the stillness of people deciding whether they were going to follow the order when it came. That was a different texture entirely, and it was new, and it meant that the resonance she'd felt spreading through the territorial root system had reached them too, in whatever way it reached people who were not wolves and did not have bloodline marks. Some ancestral frequency, some old knowing in the bones, the land making its position known in the language of bodies before minds could argue with it. She looked at Kael and said nothing. This too was something she had learned. The most powerful thing you could do in a silence was refuse to fill it. He held the sword for 11 seconds. She counted. Then he lowered it. Not dropped it, did not throw it down. Lowered it with the precise controlled movement of a man who was making sure no one watching could mistake the gesture for anything other than what it was. A choice, not a defeat. He was still doing that. Still managing the optics, still calculating the story that would be told. She found, to her own surprise, that she didn't hate him for it. It was who he was. It had always been who he was. She had simply spent 6 years hoping it was only the surface of him rather than the whole. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said, "but this part is." He looked at her one more time. The full look. The one he almost never gave anyone, that cataloged and assessed and finally landed on something she could only call recognition. The acknowledgement of a person seeing another person clearly, possibly for the first time. He turned his horse. The iron moon column parted around him as he rode back through it, and then the column itself began the slow reorientation of a military force standing down. And the sound of it, horses shifting, weapons being sheathed, the particular exhale of 50 people releasing a held breath, was one of the most complete sounds Celine had ever heard. Garen appeared at her shoulder. His cut had stopped bleeding and crusted over, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours, which he had. "That's not a concession," he said quietly. "That's a delay." "I know," she said. "He'll be in front of his lawyers inside an hour." "I know that too," she said. "Let him. The declaration stands and the archive documents are in the council record, and there are 5 elders who will hold that line." She watched the last of the Iron Moon column clear the field. "He can fight it in the council chamber. That's where I want it fought." Garen was quiet for a moment. "You wanted him to draw the sword," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." She considered denying it. Then she didn't, because Garen was 62 years old and had spent 40 of them watching young wolves discover the shape of what they were, and he deserved better than a managed answer. "I needed to know if he would," she said, "whether the calculation still came out the same way it always did, whether 6 years had changed anything. And he put it down," she said, "which is its own answer." She walked back to her people. The council session convened 3 days later in the Iron Moon capital's Elder Hall, which was the largest formal gathering space in the territory and which had, in living memory, never been used to adjudicate a succession challenge. The hall was built for pack law, minor disputes, territorial boundaries, seasonal agreements. It was not built for what it was being asked to hold now. It held it anyway. Celine walked into the Iron Moon capital through the main gate, not the eastern maintenance gate they had walked her out of 47 days earlier. She walked through the main gate in the morning light with Garen and Voss and Wren behind her, and the archive documents in their oilskin under her arm, and the wolves, the tawny one who had been first, and the others, waited at the gate's edge because the city was not a place for them yet. Yet. She held on to that word. The capital looked the same. The torches had burned down to cold iron in the morning. The cobblestones were wet from an overnight rain. The traders in the morning market were setting up their stalls with the focused indifference of people whose business survived political upheaval because people needed to eat regardless of who held what title. She walked through it all and felt the strangeness of returning to a geography she had known and which had become, in 47 days, a place she no longer needed to belong to in order to be real. This was the thing the forest had done to her that she couldn't have anticipated. She had gone in expecting, if she survived, to come out harder, more armored. The natural consequence of being broken down by cold and betrayal and near death, rebuilt into something more resistant. She had thought survival would produce a version of herself that was fortified against hurt, because it had learned to need less. Instead, she had come out. She searched for the right word as she crossed the wet cobblestones and felt the city's eyes on her. Larger. Not harder. Larger. Capable of containing more without being deformed by it. The hurt was still there, every piece of it. She had not resolved it or buried it or converted it into something useful and clean. She had simply grown around it, the way old trees grew around old wounds, incorporating the damage into the structure without letting it define the whole shape. She walked into the elder hall and sat down across the council table from Kyle Thornhart for the last time. He had his lawyers, 3 of them sharp-eyed men who had clearly worked through the night and were carrying the particular energy of professionals who had found the argument they intended to make and had sharpened it to a point. She had Ren and Harrow and Sierra and the documented archive and the territorial law that had been standing since before anyone in this room was born. What followed was 4 hours of legal argument that she would not have been able to navigate 6 weeks earlier and navigated now with the complete focus of someone who had spent 43 days learning to read 2,000-year-old governance documents by firelight in a ruined hall and who had, in that process, developed a relationship with this specific body of law that no one in this room, including Kyle's lawyers, could match. She spoke when it was her turn to speak. She was precise, and she was specific, and she did not perform confidence. She simply had it, the way you had it when you knew the material because you had lived inside it rather than studied it. Kale sat across the table and said very little. His lawyers spoke for him. His face was the controlled, unreadable face she knew, and she did not look at it more than necessary, not from avoidance, but from efficiency. She was not here to read Kyle Thornhart. She was here to finish something. At the 3rd hour, the middle lawyer, the sharpest one, the one she'd identified in the first 20 minutes as the genuine threat in the room, made his argument. The Crimson Fang protocols, he said, required not just bloodline activation and witness declaration, but territorial physical occupation. Continuous occupation of the ancestral land for a minimum of 40 days, documented and witnessed. 40 days. She had been in the forest for 43. She looked at the lawyer. Elder Syra, she said, what does the statute say about documentation of occupation? Syra, who had been waiting for this, produced 2 pages from the archive translation Ren had completed. Occupation was documented by the land itself, the territorial resonance, the bloodline marks, the wolf recognition. All 3 were present. All 3 were documented in the witnessing record from the border marker. The lawyer looked at the pages. He looked at his colleagues. He sat back. The session ended 40 minutes later. Harrow called the vote. 5 council members for, 2 abstaining, which was as close to against as they were willing to go on record. Kyle's 2 appointees on the council sat in silence and did not vote, which was its own statement. The succession claim was recognized. The binding ceremony was permanently voided. Kyle's alpha title was suspended pending a formal pack assembly vote under the territorial protocols, which would be convened within 30 days. It was done. Chet. She found him afterward in the eastern courtyard, which was where he always went when he needed to think without being watched. She had known that for 6 years. She went there alone, without Garen or Voss, and she told herself it was because what needed to happen next required privacy, and not because there was still something in her that needed to speak to him directly, outside of lawyers and councils and the formal architecture of succession law. She told herself that, and she was only partially lying. He was standing at the courtyard's eastern wall, looking out over the territory beyond the capital. His coat was undone, the alpha's seal at his collar, hands loose at his sides. He heard her coming and didn't turn around. I expected you to run the legal argument harder, she said. My lawyers ran it as hard as it would go, he said. I knew that before we walked in. She stopped beside him, not close, and looked out at the same territory. Rolling ground, tree lines in the middle distance, the dark shape of far mountains. Packland, all of it, contested and bled over for generations. The reason the succession protocols had been written in the first place. Because when power was distributed badly, the land paid for it in blood. You knew it before you drew the sword, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. Then why? He turned his head and looked at her. In the afternoon light, with no ceremony and no formal structure between them, he looked like what he was, a man who had been carrying a particular weight for a very long time and had been pretending it was something other than what it was. Because I needed to know if I still could, he said, if the thing that made me an alpha was still there when you were standing in front of me. A pause. It wasn't, but it wasn't the right thing anymore. Those aren't the same. She looked at him and felt the complexity of knowing someone completely, and having that knowledge be neither comfort nor weapon, but simply the truth of having been close to another person for a significant portion of your life. "You put the sword down," she said. "You didn't flinch," he said. Something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite anything else crossed his face. "You never flinched, not in 6 years. I just wasn't paying the right kind of attention." She was quiet for a moment. There were things she could say. The accumulated inventory of 6 years of careful silence, everything she had filed in the room in the back of her mind and managed and contained. She had imagined, in the forest, that when this moment came, she would open the room and let it all out. Some accounting, some settling of the ledger. Standing here in the actual moment, she found she didn't want to. Not because she had forgiven him. She didn't know yet what she would do with what he had done and what he hadn't done, and she was honest enough with herself not to perform forgiveness she hadn't arrived at yet. But because the accounting, the ledger, the careful inventory of wounds, those were the tools of someone who was still inside the story they were trying to get free of, and she was not inside it anymore. "The pack assembly," she said. 30 days. How do you want to handle it?" He blinked. She watched him recalibrate. "You're asking me," he said. "You know this pack," she said, "better than I do in some ways, and that's not going to change in 30 days. I'm going to need people who understand Iron Moon's internal structure, and I'm not going to pretend I don't need them out of principle." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you what you know and how you want to be useful, not for your sake. For the sake of not tearing apart a pack that's been someone's home for generations just because its alpha made choices that had to be corrected." He stared at her. "You're a harder person than you were," he said. "I'm the same person I was," she said. "You're just actually looking." He turned back to the territory. She watched the line of his shoulders, the precise quality of a person putting something down that they had been carrying for a very long time, and finding that the relief of it was complicated by the weight of what it meant to set it down. "3 families in the Eastern Quarter," he said finally, "Pack Aldrich remnants who came in quietly over the years. They know the territorial history better than any of the standing advisors. You'll want them." A pause. "Breck. My second. He's loyal to the pack, not to me personally. I think he's known how this ended for weeks. He'll hold the military structure steady through the transition if you ask him directly." She stored all of it. "And Lyra," she said. His jaw tightened. "She's gone," he said. "Left the capital 2 days ago. I don't know where." She had expected this. Lyra Vale was not a person who stayed to face outcomes she hadn't engineered. She was a person who made contingencies and executed them before anyone could require her to stand still for the consequences. "She'll surface somewhere," Celine said. "Yes," he said. "She always does. She always... When she does, she'll answer to the territorial protocols for the dissolution attempt and the exile manipulation." Celine's voice was even. "Not out of revenge, because the law requires it, and because letting it go sets a precedent I can't afford to set." "I know," he said, and then, quieter, "I let her run the exile. I signed the order. I want to be clear. I understood what I was doing. I told myself it was political necessity, and the truth was, I was afraid of you, of what you were becoming." He stopped. "I was afraid of the thing I could see in you that I knew I didn't have." She looked at him. "What thing?" she said. "Oh," he thought about it. "The ability to lose everything and not lose yourself," he said. "I've never known how to do that. Everything I am is built on not losing, on making sure there is always more I can take before something can be taken from me." He looked at her directly. "You had nothing, and you built everything. I had everything, and I built a ceiling over it to keep it from growing." She didn't know what to do with this. She had expected many things from this conversation: calculation, political maneuvering, the controlled version of Kael that managed every interaction into a favorable outcome. She had not expected this, the honesty of a man who had finally looked at himself accurately and had not liked what the accuracy revealed. It was possible to know someone for 6 years and still be surprised by them. She looked at the territory, at the rolling ground and the tree lines and the mountains in the far distance. "The pack assembly will go better if you stand before it and say what you just said to me," she said. He was quiet. "Not all of it," she said. "Not for my sake, for theirs. They followed you for a long time. They deserve to understand what happened to the person they followed and why it's different now. A pause. And they need to see that what's coming next isn't something imposed on them by an outside force. It's a correction that their own territory has been asking for. You think I'm capable of that, he said. I think you just did it, she said. In a courtyard with no audience. The audience version is harder, but it's the same act. He said nothing. The afternoon was going gray at the edges, the light flattening toward evening. You could have destroyed me in that hall, he said. Publicly. There was enough material. I know, she said. Why didn't you? She thought about Garen saying the force that holds people together and the force that drives the knife. She thought about 43 days in a forest learning the difference between what you had the right to do and what you had the judgment to do, and discovering that they were not always the same thing, and that the gap between them was where character lived. Because I'm not building a kingdom on someone's ruin, she said. I'm building it on the ground, and ruins make bad foundations. He absorbed this. She turned from the wall. 30 days, she said. The assembly. I need you present, and I need you honest. Can you do that? He looked at her one more time. The full look again, the cataloging one, and at the end of it something she hadn't seen in his face in 6 years, or perhaps had never seen there at all. Yes, he said. She walked back across the courtyard. Sam, the assembly was held on the 31st day under the open sky of Iron Moon's central gathering ground, which was the tradition for assemblies of formal consequence. The idea that decisions made with the sky above them carried the weight of the territory itself as witness. 300 pack members. Observers from 7 neighboring packs, some dissolved, some standing, who had heard the declaration and made the journey to witness what came after. The Aldrich families in their entirety. Garen and Voss and Wren and the 43, most of them, the ones who had walked out of the forest and across open territory, and through 4 hours of council arguments and 30 days of preparation. Harrow spoke first, as elder. He read the succession record and the declaration and the council ruling, in the old language and the common tongue both, clearly and without editorial. He was very good at it. She watched the crowd's faces as he read, and she saw the thing she had been watching for. Not acceptance, which was too simple and too fast to be real, but the beginning of the question that preceded acceptance. The opening of a door in people's understanding that had been closed not by malice, but by the assumption that some doors were permanent. Cale spoke second. He stood before his pack, the pack he had led for 12 years, the pack that had been his structure and his purpose, and the primary relationship of his adult life. And he said what she had told him to say. He said it in his own language, not hers, with the particular texture of a man who had learned something the hard way, and was not going to dress the learning up in language that made it sound easier than it was. He talked about the choices he had made and why he had made them and what he understood now about the cost. He did not perform contrition. He did not manage the optics. He stood still and was honest, and she watched 300 wolves feel the truth of it land differently than a managed version would have. He was very good at this, she discovered, when he allowed himself to be. When the performance fell away and what was underneath it had something real to say. When he was done, he stepped back, and the ground was quiet. She stepped forward. She had thought, in the forest, about what she would say at a moment like this, had run through versions of it, the versions that were about her, about what had been done to her, and what she had built in response, about the bloodline and the archive and the legal protocols. She had drafted the speech in her head a dozen times, each version slightly different. Standing before them now, she said none of it. This land is old, she said. Older than every pack in this territory, and older than the wars that divided it, and older than the names we've given each other and the names we've taken away. She looked at the crowd, not performing, not projecting, just looking, the way she had learned to look from 6 weeks of sitting with the archive by firelight. It's been waiting for people to remember that the land doesn't belong to whoever holds the title. The title belongs to whoever serves the land. That's not a law I invented. It's the law the ground has been running on since before any of us were born. Mutam Biscan. She paused. She let it sit. I was exiled here to die, she said. I want to be honest about that because I think pretending it was something else would be an insult to everyone in this space who witnessed it or heard about it. That was what it was. She let that be true for a moment in front of everyone who needed to see it named. What I found instead was the ground of my own bloodline, and the documentation of what this territory was supposed to be, and the understanding that what was done to me was not an accident of one man's politics, but the symptom of a system that had been running wrong for a very long time. She looked at Harrow, at Garen, at the tawny wolf who had been allowed inside the gathering ground and was sitting at the crowd's edge in the direct sun with the specific comfort of something that was exactly where it was supposed to be. "I'm not here to rule over this territory," she said. "I'm here to return it to itself. There's a difference, and I intend to spend whatever time I have making sure everyone in this space understands what the difference looks like in practice, not just in language." She looked at the crowd one more time. "I'll make mistakes. I don't know all of this territory's grief yet. I don't know all of your names. I will learn both." She let the last sentence settle. "That's the only promise I'm making today. Everything else we build together." Ba-chum-chit. The assembly was quiet for a moment. Then Garen, standing at the crowd's left edge, put his right fist against his chest and bowed his head. One by one, in the irregular, organic way of things that were not rehearsed and not commanded, the assembled wolves did the same. Not everyone. Some stood still. Some exchanged glances. Some looked at the ground with the expression of people who needed more time, which was fair, which was honest, which was exactly the right response to a change this large. But enough of them. Enough that the territory, watching, understood that what was being witnessed was not the installation of a conqueror, but the activation of a correction. Something that had been bent for a long time, straightening, with all the slowness and the labor that straightening required. She stood in the morning light, and she let herself feel it. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more durable than either. The specific quality of having arrived somewhere real after a long journey through terrain that had tried at multiple points and in multiple ways to tell her she was not the kind of person who arrived anywhere. She had been made, unmade, rebuilt in the dark by cold and silence and the accumulated weight of survival. She had come out of it not harder but larger, not invulnerable but honest about the shape of her vulnerabilities, which was its own kind of strength, the kind that didn't crack under pressure because it already knew which parts of it were fragile and had made its peace with that knowledge. The greatest lesson of the forest in the end was not about power. She had learned power in the forest, the real kind, the kind rooted in land and blood and the slow trust of things that did not give trust easily. But the thing the forest had taught her that no archive document or succession protocol could have given her was simpler and harder and more permanent. She had learned who she was when everything was taken away, and she had discovered that the answer was enough. That the person who remained when the title and the position and the careful performance of belonging were stripped down to nothing was a person who could build something real because she had built herself back from nothing, and that process, unrepeatable and unlosable, was the only foundation that could not be taken. She had been born, the last of a bloodline the world had declared dead. She had decided in a cold ruin under a silver moon that dead was a word for things that agreed to stop. She had not agreed. She stood before her people in the morning light. Her people, the words settling into her chest with the warmth of something finally true. And she breathed in the smell of the territory and the gathered wolves and the old stone of Iron Moon's walls behind her. And she looked at the sky above the open gathering ground, and for the first time in memory, possibly for the first time in her entire life, she did not feel like something that was surviving. She felt like something that had arrived. The silver moon, invisible in the daylight sky, was there nonetheless, as it was always there. The constant above the territory, the light that did not originate with any pack or any bloodline, but fell equally on the ruins and the rebuilt both. She had stood under it in the worst night of her life and in the best one. It had witnessed her exile and her declaration and the 43 days between and the 30 after that. It witnessed this too. The first wolf empress of the Crimson Fang, standing on the ground her bloodline had bled for, looking at the sky with her hands open at her sides and the silver marks bright on her forearms in the morning sun, leading not from the certainty of being unbreakable, but from the hard-won knowledge of exactly how she had broken and exactly how she had put herself back together and exactly what she intended to build on the ground where she was standing. Not a throne, a home.